Hello, lovely humans, I hope. Today, we're going to be talking about why modding is so useful. Using DnD, obviously. Now, DnD aside, modding is actually a very useful way of learning design because it functions as kind of a microcosm of the overall process. Building a vision while keeping all of the elements of the game in mind, how your tension affects the decisions and how the pillars affect the designs and how the systems affect the mechanics and how this system works with this system. It's all a bit overwhelming for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience. And modding is by far the preferred method of designing for dungeon masters. Now, like I said, modding is a little microcosm of design, and that's really great because it gives you a chance to not have to worry about all that stuff yet and start with something small, something bite-sized, something that you can very much deal with without having to worry about some crazy nonsense that you probably aren't prepared to deal with if you're just getting started. Basically, you still need to figure out what you're going to be making, but in a much more structured way, and modding lets you skip the part where you have to build the whole structure first. Of course, this definitely applies to really any modding you want to do, regardless of medium, but I like TTRPGs and D&D in particular because of the ease of access, because of the ease of implementation, the ease of playtesting, and the ease of iteration. No, I'm not saying that D&D is the only possible way to achieve this, but if you're modding in anything and your goal is really to learn design and less to mod for that thing, then really those are the criteria you should be looking for your chosen medium. Whether it's D&D or some other TTRPG or a card game or a board game, anything that you think you can actually take the structure from the thing and then make something interesting in a microcosm of it. And this is the other nice thing about modding is that getting started is pretty easy because if you start modding a game that you like, that you feel something about, then you probably have some opinion on how things should or shouldn't work. Now that's really useful because it drives you towards something that you care about. And we're going to skip the part where we do deep analysis and talk about what good analysis looks like for that game. And for now, for this application, we're going to say, you know what? I don't like how X works. Is a perfectly acceptable way to approach modding for this purpose. A great example of this actually is part 1 of my D&D homebrew class design series because I start with, I don't like wild magic. I don't think it works very well. And I lay out a little bit of a case for that, but I really don't do a lot of work to lay out some kind of big objective case of how wild magic works. It's not really an argument. It's just I don't like wild magic and I would prefer if it works this other way. And all of the actual design work went into how can I make it work that way in a way that makes sense and that's cohesive and that generates designs that I can be proud of. And that really is the trick, is building something cohesive within that structure. And this is where the microcosm part comes in. So I'm going to start with flight as a system in 5th edition because I don't like it. And that's it. That's my whole thing. I'm just going to say I don't like it and that's good enough for now. It's good enough for now. You should have it in the back of your head that that is not an effective analysis, that that's not a good way to look at a game system. It's not an effective way to look at the way some mechanics work in a way that would be useful to you. But we're going to intentionally bypass that process in this instance because it's not really relevant to what we're about to do. So I identified the problem with flight in 5th edition. And I say problems because it's not really problems. I'm just defining a new direction and then figuring out a system that will push us in that direction. The idea of problems suggests that what I've done previously is actually an effective objective analysis when, as I've stated, it is not. And I know I keep saying that, but it really isn't. And it's important to remember that it's not. And even though we're saying we're not going to worry about that now, it is also important to acknowledge that what we've just done is not good analysis. That's not what we've done here. It's not the purpose of this, and that's why we're not going into it. But it's not good analysis. There are really 2 things that I want to address here. The first is the idea of player flight, because a lot of DMs have a problem with players who gain flight, who gain abilities that allow them to fly or magic items or whatever, and then flight becomes this way to bypass a whole bunch of stuff that they're designing. And yes, as a DM, you can design things in a way that flight can't easily bypass them. But that's a big burden to put on a DM because now every single thing has to account for this one ability that one player has, or multiple, but this one element of the game now fundamentally changes everything the DM has to worry about. And that's a huge burden to have to deal with. It's for every single encounter to have to also ask the question, what about flight? And partly because it's a huge burden, and partly because the D&D 5th edition system doesn't give you a lot of tools to address that issue, the solutions often end up being things like, well, I'm just going to put you in a roofed area so that you can't fly, or there's an anti-magic field so that you can't fly. There's always some just excuse for why flight doesn't work here. And we want to try to avoid that, because if the player has the ability to fly, they should be able to take that ability and apply it as a solution to problems. And as good designers, we need to be worried about what are the problems that I can put in front of the player so that flight is an interesting solution, but not the only solution. And the second big thing is monster flight. And this is really important because think about a big dragon, like an ancient dragon, and the problem that a lot of DMs have with dragons, which is, well, wouldn't a dragon be really terrifying? Like, dragons are super smart, right? So how come they don't just fly around forever, recharge their breath weapon, and then murder everything with no actual threat to them? Well, that's actually a really good question. And of course, they would probably do that. They are intelligent creatures. So now you have this weird problem where if I don't do that, my dragon feels stupid for no reason. But if I do that, then I have an issue where the dragon actually flies around and the players have no way to deal with that. And that's terrible. And now you are in this weird position where you either have to rework dragons completely or all of these problems. Like, all of these little issues arise when we can probably resolve a lot of them by just tweaking flight a little bit. So basically, here's my approach. I'm going to create a proficiency in flight for both players and monsters, because it's important that these things follow more or less the same rules. That's important because we want players to be able to anticipate the abilities of creatures, and we want the abilities of creatures to roughly mirror the player's abilities so that when they act, nothing seems so crazy and alien that the players are just completely at a loss as to how to deal with it. That's important because if you were to think about things like, well, a beholder, for example, is some crazy like alien thing that's totally different from anything you're supposed to have experienced in the main material world. But if you actually made something completely alien, players wouldn't know how to interact with it. And if players don't know how to deal with a problem, then you're not creating gameplay. And this is one of the big things that I talk about in D&D all the time is DMs occasionally act like the game element is sort of this embarrassment that we need to get rid of and sort of hide. It's not really part of it. It's a storytelling game, but it's a game first. And the way you know that is because everything comes down to how players manage a problem. If the players don't know how to manage the problem, everything falls apart. Everything comes to a complete standstill. Unless you just have things happen completely irrespective of the player's input, at which point people complain that they're being railroaded. And I know railroading isn't necessarily a bad thing, but don't worry about that. Don't worry about that right now. Flight is the thing. Flight and modding. These are the things we're talking about. So we have this proficiency. Players have this proficiency now. What do we do with it? Well, we want flight to feel kind of precarious for players. Why? Well, because we want them to fly, but we want them to feel like there's a risk to flying. We want them to feel like there's a real threat. If they get knocked out of the sky, they can plummet to their death, maybe. There's some actual downsides to zipping around in the air. And the proficiency will also apply to enemies. And we're going to tie it to size because basically all PCs are medium or smaller. So if we have something that applies based on size, we make sure that it applies to medium creatures and below, basically the way we would want it to apply to PCs, then that'll work out pretty well. And in general, that should work out pretty well for creatures too, because medium creatures are going to be easier to knock out of the sky than a big dragon probably. So we'll try to build a system around that. So all we need to do is give the creatures a little bit of a buffer. So we'll just give one to any creature that's large or larger, so that as that dwindles, they get closer to getting knocked out of the sky, which means players now have an opportunity to knock them out of the sky. But it's actually a pretty difficult opportunity because if you're a big dragon, like a gargantuan creature, like an ancient dragon, you have a pretty huge buffer, and you're pretty likely to succeed on the saving throw, which we're going to use to make sure that those things occur the way we need them and roughly at the rate that we want them to. So looking at this system and continuing to use an ancient dragon as an example, you would have such a high chance of succeeding your constitution saving throws, your concentration checks, that your threshold isn't really going to lower by that much, that frequently. Well, why is that important? Because a big creature is going to be obviously harder to knock out of the sky, but this still gives you the ability to deal with it. Because now if you're trying to knock a dragon out of the sky, the question isn't how do we even do that? The question is, how can we survive long enough to do that? Or do we have anything that will make it harder for the dragon to make their save? Do we have anything that can pelt the dragon with attacks? So now things like doing a lot of little weak attacks is a good way to knock a dragon out of the sky, or doing 1 or 2 really big attacks depending on how big you think you can make the attack. So you see these little tactical options begin to unfold, and that's all because the dragon has this opportunity to be brought out of the sky, and that's all thanks to the mechanic. That's not narrative. I want to make that very clear. This isn't a narrative solution. This is a gameplay problem with a gameplay solution. So we're changing it so that things can get knocked out of the sky, and we're pushing that to be a little bit more tactical so that the mechanics imply the tactics, which is going to help players even who aren't that tactical, because these questions are going to be very clear, very obvious. And again, I really want you to be thinking about, like, look at how easy this was. We just modded it really quickly, and dealing with flight isn't that big of a problem. It's a small little consideration. We didn't have to worry about a whole ton of stuff. We didn't have to figure out what the gameplay experience of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is. We just had to figure out, oh, here's a little statement about flight, and here's how we can address that statement about flight in a way that changes flight to be more sort of in line with what I'm looking for. That's it. That's all we did. It's a very small little tweak. It works pretty well. It's not too number crunchy. It's not too complex. It's not bad. And you know, it's definitely a mod. And you can see the telltale signs of the mod. It's not exactly in line with the way 5th edition is. 5th edition would like it to be much more streamlined. That's why the initial flight system is the way that it is. But you can definitely see how it addresses all the things that I wanted to address. And that's great. That's what modding is all about. You don't have to worry about going crazy and all this other stuff and the high level vision and all the stuff. It's just a little thing. And modding is awesome for that. You take that and you put that in the context of sort of the core of a design process. And if you want to go through what the design process might look like, you can check out the Homebrew series, because that actually does guide you through the process a little bit more clearly in terms of here's how you kind of go from a vision to mechanics. In this case, that's all it is, a little microcosm of the design. And then as you expand outward from that, you can learn to do bigger visions, because you start to see how individual mechanics affect individual player decisions and player behaviors. And then as you gain experience, you start to be able to put more and more of those things into a single context, which allows you to build the structure that allows you to build the vision. So that's really it. This is a follow-up to my How D&D Can Teach Game Design video, because there were some comments that I think had a fair criticism that the videos didn't really go into depth as to why TTRPGs and D&D specifically were so good at teaching design, as opposed to something like teaching board games, because I made an argument mainly geared around technical limitations. So I just wanted to delve a little bit deeper into why modding and why D&D specifically, and I like the flight system as an example because it's a very simple little system, but it does accomplish all the things you tried to accomplish. All right, that's it for me for today. Next week, we'll probably do something that isn't very D&D related, because that's 2 D&D videos in a row. Don't forget to do all the stuff, read the description, there's links. Join us on Discord. Yeah, okay, bye.